Good morning. Good morning, Doug. How are you?
Doing well.
Good, good, good. Hey, excited about today's show. We've got a great resource that's agreed to join us. It's a Chief Chief Horn with Kansas City Public Schools, lifelong law enforcement professional. I know Doug, you and Chief, I believe, worked together in Kansas City PD for some period of time. Correct?
Yep, Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. Yep, we were there
Yep.
for 20 years together. Numerous times. It was interesting as we both kind of moved up. I was underneath him several times during that my career. So he's a good man.
So kind of a mentor of yours then.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Well, that's fun. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting conversation. Chief Horn's going to be joining us here in just a few minutes. He was wrapping up another meeting, and we got a text a few minutes ago that he was walking across campus. So he should be joining us anytime, so we can get started on the conversation. But leading up to that, is there anything you want to share before Chief Horn joins us?
Well, it's interesting. You and I have had lots of conversations about school safety, and the most important thing to understand is that it is definitely about layers. You can hire an SRO, but that SRO is good for only the time he's there, anytime, or he or she is there. And the thing that people sometimes miss is this idea that if somebody's intent on doing bad things, they're just going to attempt to plan around whatever security measures you have in place. And so you need to have multiple layers. You can't just say, all right, we have cameras and that should satisfy it. We have access control or that'll satisfy it. It's all about multiple layers, and it's about that approach. But one of the things that's always so interesting to me that I talk about when we look at things like metal detectors or X-ray machines that schools look at installing is that they look at it based on what I call the federal model, which is in federal buildings, they're able to, they have almost unlimited budgets, but two, they have the ability to control access down to say one pinch point, right? The front door or whatever door that they have everybody come through. And so everybody has to go through screening at that point. And we just don't design our schools that way. And it wouldn't be practical to design your school that way. And to think that you can somehow create a pinch point doesn't take into account everything that happens from, football practices and baseball practices and softball and all these kids that are going in and out the doors and front doors and back doors. And you have teacher parking lots and school bus drop-off entrances and front doors and back, student lot entries. And so all of a sudden, if you're sitting there trying to think like, okay, let's, focus everything down to one location, or should we try and have security at all those locations? And whenever I've, talked to superintendents or administrators, they say, well, it's not such a horrible thing to have multiple points of entry. It always brings me back to the Kansas City airport. For years and years, I will be honest, I have always loved the Kansas City airport. It's always one of the most accessible airports in the country. Don't know if you've ever flown into it, but you can literally, depending on what gate you're at, you can literally get off your plane, walk 100 feet, get into the car that's picking you up and drive off.
Yeah, it is one of the most convenient airports I've ever flown in or out of. And it's the exact opposite of, say, DFW or Atlanta or O'Hare or it's the exact opposite of all those, no doubt.
And so to kind of, for people that aren't familiar with the airport, what's so neat about it is that like the original 3 terminals were just kind of circles, and so you could drive up, and so it was just if you can imagine a curved strip mall, that was basically, there was 3 of those that were just gigantic, and so you could find out what gate your party was coming in on, drive on up, get in there. Well, then 9/11 happened, and we had to start dealing with stuff, and so that became a challenge to the way the airport was designed, because it wasn't really big enough to put in all these checkpoints. So they did have to create, let's just say, checkpoints that enabled them to control about 6 or 7 gates at a time. Well, that was too manpower intensive. So what they did was they started doing some engineering stuff, and they expanded it to where at least they had 1 or 2 checkpoints per terminal. But what they've recently done is they voted to spend, and I'm not misspeaking here, they voted to spend billions of dollars redesigning the airport so they could have one front entry checkpoint. And so they're just basically saying it doesn't matter what airline, everybody that comes into the airport is going to check through, this one major thing. And so if you think about it, that you say, hey, the airport over the years has transition from multiple checkpoints to this, and now they're finally down to 1 checkpoint. What they're telling you, it was too difficult to do all of those checkpoints. It was too manpower intensive. It was too much labor. It was too many machines, all the stuff that it took. that they're now just saying, forget it, we're done. We're just going to create it down to one, checkpoint. And then we go back to the schools and say, why do you think you're going to be able to do, by having multiple checkpoints, something that the Federal Aviation Administration, the Kansas City, airport, and all that sort of stuff, they're not able to do it, but somehow, a lot of these schools think, well, we can figure it out. It's like,
well, isn't that always the case though? And I'm not just picking on schools. I know they're dealing with a lot of things. They've got a lot of stuff going on. I get that. And I've said this, as a parent, I've always said education is not the number one responsibility of the school. Number one responsibility of the school is the safety of the children that they're given, that we give to them every day to educate. And obviously education is important, but it is to get them home in the same condition that we sent them there.
Right. And that providing a safe environment is critical. And that's the things that we talk about. And again, going back to it, that's why the layers are so important, is that don't think that, hey, but the other thing too is there's a time component to it, but there's also a cost to it, right? Like I've always used this example. I remember it from when I was getting my master's, but it's the idea that, hey, I could hire someone to clean my house, and I can, hire someone for an hour and they're going to clean 90% of my house. And so in other words, if I pay for 2 hours, I might get 95% of my house cleaned. And if I, pay for 3 hours, I might get 98% of my house. And so at what point do you say, hey, I'm never going to get my house 100% clean. I'm never going to do this sort of stuff, but what am I spending my money on? And is it worthwhile? And the aspect that we look at is that, metal detectors, X-ray machines, and the staff that's required to, fill those are very expensive endeavors. And you say to yourself, and what is it you're trying to accomplish by doing that? Because you're never going to get to 100% security. And the quick story I can tell you is that when I was in Kansas City, Kansas, at one of the high schools, there was a student that had a gun in the school. And they asked the student after he got caught with the gun, now here's the thing real quick, it was unloaded. He was only using it because he had been bullied. And he said, if I ever get bullied again, I was going to, pull it out of his locker. But eventually somebody turned him in. But they said, how did you get the gun in the school? He said, well, I knew tomorrow morning the coach told us we were going to be walking the track. So the night before I came to school, put the gun in a paper bag and put it in the trash can right by the track. And when we were walking on the track, I walked over, got it, tucked it in my pants, and came into the school with it. So he had gone through the initial checkpoint that morning, but he just knew a way to get it in. And so it's those sort of things.
And what's the saddest thing about that? I mean, obviously it shows how easy it is to compromise something like that, but that kids today in our schools have to think like that. Right.
It is unfortunate that he, one, that he felt the need to protect himself.
Right.
But two, that he's also planning, figuring out pretty easily how to bypass this sort of stuff.
Well, and and to your point though, I mean, we've all been to security checkpoints, or where there's, we just went a couple of weeks ago, went and watched the greatest college basketball team in the world, Kansas Jayhawks, compete at the regional tournament down in Fort Worth. And before we could go on the premises, they had metal detectors. They do the thing. They warn you. They do all that. They look through your bag, but then they have you walk through the metal detector. And I'm thinking, I'm counting as I'm there. There were six people standing where there was two entry metal detectors. 6 people. And so I don't know what the cost is for those 6 people, but I know it's not cheap.
Right. And these are the things you have to think about. So let's just take this for an example. Let's say you do have an entire line of students. How many adults do you need? How many, security personnel do you need checking students in? One, it's going to slow things down. So you need multiple, metal detectors. But what happens when the metal detector goes off, right? Like, all right, now somebody has to check them. So now you're getting into the situations where, are you using a handheld metal device? Well, what if they keep, let's say that they keep it signals off. Now all of a sudden, you have the permission, that you've got a 15-year-old student that you're going to now have to lay hands on. And how extensive is that search going to be? These are the type of things that schools look at, and you start to say, okay, well, this isn't what we're going to do. We don't want to be in these situations. We don't want students bringing things in, but then all of a sudden you find out it's something in their clothing, right? It's a zipper. It's something that just kind of, is that what we need to be laying our hands on our kids for these innocuous type of things? You have the X-ray machines, right? Those things, they work great, but then how are you going to train the people to do that? You can't just sit there and say, I know what to look for, and because it's going to come and there's going to be an arrow that says gun. It doesn't work that way. It's going to be the 3-ring binders, the projects that they're bringing in, wiring, all these sort of things. Those understanding how to recognize what is contraband and what's not is something that takes extensive training. And so you sit there and say, okay, so now we're going to have to send these people off for a week or bring somebody in. And a lot of the companies that provide these X-ray machines, they provide that training, but it's something that is a learning curve and learning how to identify what's in those X-rays and all this sort of stuff. So you all of a sudden understand now what I've done is as opposed to allowing the students to just enter the building, now all of a sudden I've created a backlog. And so, like, what do you do about tardiness, right? What happens when the tardiness is because of too many incidents that morning? So now I have 100 kids still waiting in queue to get through the metal detectors. Those are the type of things that schools sit there and look at and say, again, how much effort are we putting into for a problem that, although important, is not as pervasive as the public seems to think it is, with kids bringing weapons into schools.
Yeah, and then I look at and we've talked about this in past conversations, but the searching of a child. And I know there is a I know you talked about one time, when you can and can't, and what warrants a search and what doesn't, and you give up some of your rights to privacy or to depending on the situation. But I'm not even discussing about the legal side of it. I'm just saying, if an alarm goes off and it's a 15-year-old young lady or young man, I could see, and then it turns out to be the binder and their person's searched, I could see a lot of upset parents. You know what I mean? And so you're creating real problems on the other side that you've got to deal with. And I know you alluded to that a little bit, but because there's so much misunderstanding, I think, about what a school can and can't do when it comes to these types of issues. Would you agree with that? That there's just a lot of misinformation out there?
I certainly do. I apologize for my distraction.
No, you're good.
I'm trying to get Henry Horn. He said he can't
log in.
He said he hasn't gotten the link, so I apologize for that. So yeah, we're just trying to troubleshoot that. So, and that is the interesting thing, is that parents, as much as they want their kids to be safe, you all of a sudden understand you're giving up yet another layer of privacy, and you are exposing your children to an environment that we're really trying to protect them from. And when we think about this sort of stuff, again, we always need to prepare for the possibility that something's going to happen, but we have to understand the reality of the probability is extremely low. You are 30 times more likely to have an armed student in your school than you are to have a tornado warning in your school. You are 60 times more you are 60 times more likely for the tornado. It's 30 times more likely for the fire. And what we look at is that the probability of those are extremely low, but they're all very possible. And it's that possibility we want to prepare for. And none of the parents say, hey, don't build the storm safety room, don't put the fire alarm in, or things like that, because those things aren't likely. They're saying we want you to protect our children. But to that same level, how much do we need to make the child feel uncomfortable, make them feel that not only are they don't feel safe anymore, they now almost feel persecuted just by coming to school, because now they're being investigated constantly, and they're being searched and that sort of stuff. And those are the type of things that we want to avoid when we're dealing with students in schools. And the parents are the ones that have to deal with the kids coming home saying, what happened? Oh, I got pulled out of line today because the metal detector went off and they searched me, and I just was so embarrassed, and I just don't want to go to school anymore, and those sort of things. And that's what parents think, like, well, they're keeping my kid safe, but at the same time, I'm now putting my kid through trauma that they might not necessarily need to do. And you question how much is it that we are gaining by having every kid go through a metal detector type of thing.
Do you think, I know it is just it's common sense, but you see more and more parents making alternative educational decisions for their children. And I know I've talked to folks that safety is a major reason why a lot of these people make those decisions. I don't think we're really talking about that much, though, are we? Aren't we just kind of brushing over that?
We are, and what's interesting is it's not always just safety from violence. It's also exposure to other things that are happening on schools, these sort of cultural influence and stuff like that.
Right.
But like bullying is a real thing, but sometimes that bullying has to do with just the clothes you wear or the TikTok and stuff like that. So those are
Yeah.
the things that we have to look at. Looks like Chief
Yeah.
Horn has joined us. So
It does. Go ahead, Doug.
Good morning. Good morning.
Chief Horn, thanks for taking the time to join us. We were just talking about a couple things. We went through some stuff talking about the multiple entrances on schools. We were talking about X-ray machines and metal detectors. And I did mention a little bit about the airport, about how as much as they tried to do it, for years with multiple security checkpoints, they finally just gave up, and they're spending billions of dollars to create it so that there's just one giant entry point. And so what we're really looking for you to do is to just kind of, we know you're a client of SafeDefend. You have our system in the schools to alert you and your law enforcement community to any threats, but also that you have various security measures in the way of X-ray machines and metal detectors. And we wanted you to just kind of talk to us about how you handle things with multiple entrances, how you do the cost, what it entails for training, and the type of stuff that maintenance on those sort of things, and just kind of what you can fill us in on.
Well, obviously, school settings are very different than commercial buildings and everything like this. They're still public buildings. They're still welcoming. They are full of multiple entrances. Most generally, with the perspective of how they take place, we usually route all the kids through one main entrance. And this is just a layered approach. I mean, we use this with different, safety and school safety is everyone's responsibility, and it's not just a mechanical machine or a device or anything like that. It's constant evaluation and obviously knowing where your kids are, whether they're in an instructional classroom or in a hallway or a passing period, into that stuff. In reference to devices we use metal detectors and X-ray machines, and it's in all of our high schools and our middle schools. We have 7 middle schools and 5 high schools. Once again, it's a layered approach with secured entryways. That's our primary entrances to our access to our building. And it's kind of vetted approach to where whoever it is it's outside entrance first, then you have a threshold before they come into the building, and then they have access to an office point when they're dealing with consumers and customers or parents and so on. As far as the maintenance, and once again, metal detectors and X-ray machines are not a catch-all. They can be very expensive, and most of the time, an X-ray machine is licensed through the state of Kansas. It also has a variety of issues that are pretty much to like sole source vendors and everything. So maintenance can be extraordinarily high. And metal detectors and X-ray machines are to capture objects that are metal, whether they be weapons or whether they be belt buckles or anything else that comes in with kids, and especially nowadays, most importantly, these devices that come in all the time. So they're there as a layered protection, and you have a lot of different entrances throughout the building. We have some of our structures that have over 100 doors on them, and they have different multiple entry points. The most important part is those are always locked at all times, and we have like outdoor camera monitors and everything to that degree. But you cannot be every place at every time of the day. It's kind of the old adage: you can put a cop on every corner, and you'd have crime that would occur in the middle of the block. But we have a variety of issues that take place that are unique to our school system that may not be unique to other school systems. But we use this, once again, as just a layered approach, and hopefully most of the individuals adhere to them. We have no issues to it. I know when I went to school in this school district several years ago, they didn't have those issues with those devices such as metal detectors and X-ray machines. So I'm not used to that even as an adult, but our kids are very much used to it. It's no different than going through TSA at an airport. Nowadays in the 21st century, it's just another procedure or protocol that you're doing walking into a building just to make sure that we're trying to maintain safety while our kids are getting instructional periods during the day.
Real quick, just to give us, so our audience has a better understanding, let's break it down to just say one high school with one entrance. Talk to us about the personnel, the number of metal detectors, and the number of X-ray machines you might have at, like I said, just one entrance at one high school.
So normally, and I have to say this, pre-COVID, we only had Wyandotte High School is our largest high school here in our city. It has, a population that could be anywhere between 16 to 2,000 kids. And we got a great administrative team there that works diligently, but we only have two primary locations. And it's usually on the front door centered where we have bus drop off in the morning, routing kids through the building. And then once we route our kids through the building, then they're routed to pick up their breakfast meals and then off to their FA classes and everything to the beginning of the day. For our staff, we're kind of a few school districts here in the metro area that have their own police department. And most of our high schools have, right now, 1 to 2. We're going to increase those numbers of law enforcement officers, and they are certified school resource officers through the NASRO model. And then we augment what we call school safety associates. They're non-law enforcement civilians that work to kind of help with hall monitoring, day-to-day stuff. And then when we're busy doing other law enforcement activities and SRO duties throughout the day, they're also on our main entry point, so that if we have visitors, guests, or anybody checking in, we have somebody to check them through a secured point.
Phil, do you have anything? Or
well, I think again, I look at all this stuff through a parent's lens, and and my wife was a career educator. Hearing her stories when she'd come home, Chief, and I think my first thing I'd say is, boy, it's unfortunate that this is where we are, in society. But I understand that we have to do these things. But talk a little bit about the immediate response. I know we're talking about the machines and the manpower to take care of those. But what do you see? We've talked about that. What do you see as kind of the benefit, if you will, of a SafeDefend type system?
Well, I think once again, it's a layered approach. So speaking directly with a SafeDefend system, I think what we get in that is that anytime we have that unusual occurrence that would occur with an active assailant or anything, the most important part is that we have mass notification, an instantaneous mass notification. We want to notify the first responders because they have a particular task to do. And at the same time, we want to notify everybody in the building so that they can take safety actions. And we use the I Love You Guys protocols in our school system. So they would either go to a lockdown if we had an active assailant, or if we had an incident involving a medical problem or maybe a behavior issue or something like that, they could move into the hold. But most importantly, the SafeDefend system provides us a mass notification tool like no other, that single point identifies where we might be alerting us as first responders to come to, and then outside of our reaction is what we're getting from the metropolitan area. Obviously, we've had some recent events take place in our metropolitan area, and if that bell rings, then there's a lot of resources coming. So mass notification and mass coordination is very important at that point in time.
Yeah, I think too, Doug and I were talking about, Chief, that as a parent, again, I've always said the number one job of schools is to protect our children, even in my opinion, ahead of educating our children. Obviously they're there to be educated, but we want them to be safe and in a healthy environment. Talk a little bit about, and this is a little off topic here, but talk a little bit about, the need for, seems like bullying leads to so many of these situations. Is that just a parent's naive perspective, or is that what you see?
Well, I think it's not a naive perspective. I think, bullying is the 21st century term when you go back from ages and kids were picking on one another. But it's not just a term. There is a statutory law that provides that. And there's regulations that's put upon the school district that when a child is in the custody and care of educators, then there is inherent responsibility of the schools to maintain safety for all people, including the children as well. So that's twofold. That is where, that's where we've come to the 21st century, and it's moved forward to where we just thought, kids are just kids, given whatever area you grow up into. But now it's not. It's no different than sexual harassment, Title IX issues, and everything else. Those are very serious, and schools are obligated under the color of the law to address those issues.
Yeah, we always are talking, Doug and I, the whole team at SafeDefend, we're always talking about, different ways that we can get training and programs out to folks to help, educate and arm the adults, the educators, the classroom teachers, the site administration, school resource officials, whatever the case may be, on what kind of tools can we give them to better equip them to go out and handle these things, to hopefully prevent these things from ever getting to that point. Do you see that as a continued need? I mean, those types of things within districts. I know they're doing more and more things, but if you had a magic wand, what would be some stuff you would focus on?
Well, I think we have to have a consistent model of training. I mean, here in the metropolitan area, there is a model of response that takes place, and everybody needs to be trained to those standards. But also, each school system or each district has its own protocols and procedures, so that everybody needs to know those, like they know instruction time and like they know how they're going to teach math or science or anything. Because it's not a matter if, it's a matter when. And we've grown up for ages dealing with tornado drills, fire drills, and everything else. And unfortunately, we are here in the 21st century where we have violence that can take place. And I want to remind everybody listening that our schools are very, very, very safe anywhere in the metropolitan or anywhere in the United States. But unfortunately, we have these chain of events, and rare as they may be, they can still come to your front door. Yeah. So I think no different than we're teaching our instructional models, whatever they might be using, if they're using a multi-tiered system of support, or they're using whatever they might be using to instruct kids, to educate them, is that safety has to be forefront with everything else, because we do live in that time now that it's not just testing for fire drills and not just testing for tornado drills.
Yeah, I tell people all the time, I feel very fortunate to have been born in the 60s and going through the school system in the 70s, because we didn't have to worry about things it seems that our babies worry about today. You know, my biggest concern, I get a pimple that popped up overnight, you know, and now, you know, now our kids are dealing with so many other things. And to your point, Chief, that's their normal. I mean, kids today, they've always dealt with these kind of things in schools. You know, I think it is us guys our age that look at it and go, gosh, that's, you know, now it is normal, but it's also, you know, it's got to create a sense of angst, I guess, to some degree.
I appreciate that. And Doug, I know you're about to say something, but I think the world comes so systematically easier nowadays to our children because they walk around with these devices.
Yep.
And there's nothing wrong with that, because as parents, this is the closest thing to having our kids right next to us to communicate with. So that's a smart thing. Unfortunately, with good things are some bad issues that come along with them. But, you know, we say that, but if we look a generation before our generation too, they were looking at different fear. You know, they were climbing underneath the desk, when we know today that that wasn't probably a smart thing to do, or that could even help. But they were at least trying to prepare for something that was an unknown. And then look what we've done as a society with COVID. We were inviting, you know, we're looking at how do we defend ourselves from the invisible person and all the mitigation that we went through with that. So it is really just safety mitigation when you get down to it.
Right. Doug?
So, Chief, yeah, I did want to talk to you. So anecdotally, we've been looking at a lot of these articles that are coming around saying that school violence is on the increase and the number of weapons are there. Or that are at school are being seized. I know that I use things like the CDC Understanding School Violence, or the Youth Risks Behavior Report that comes out every 2 years, the FBI sort of crime data, and then the Secret Service comes out with their report. But what can you speak to in the sense of what are you seeing in the way of numbers, violence, incidents, weapons that are coming through it now? Just to say it as the school year is starting to wrap up, but like we don't have the numbers for the year yet. But have you noticed an increase in these sort of things, or what can you speak of without, I'm not asking for specific numbers,
no.
But what's your feeling as to what's going on versus what we see anecdotally?
I appreciate that. And this is my 5th plus year that I've been here in the school district. And obviously our schools were shut down and our kids were remote for about 2 years. So what you have to do is put this back on the perspective of families, and you put it back on the perspective of adolescents. We have now second graders that never saw kindergarten and first grade, and we have seniors that never saw high school. So you put that together with the adolescent brain, you put it together with everything else. So I believe that's the uptick, if there's any uptick in like disturbances or fights or schoolhouse frays and everything to that degree. But you got to say that's symptomatic to kind of what's going on in the world. So it's not just school specific. It's kind of drawn a bigger picture of where we're at in the world and how things are kind of uneasy. And, we're how do we even walk into a public restaurant? People are saying this one thing or another because of what's taking place. So you put that in our adult brains and we can kind of cope with that a little bit easier, but you put that with an adolescent brain and it kind of gets a little bit complicated. So I still say today our schools are very safe. I don't care what part of the world you're in here in the United States, but and what city you may occupy, whether you have a low economic status or you're in a high affluent neighborhood, you're still going to have issues. We're dealing with children and we're dealing with adolescents. The most important thing is that we're focused on educating kids. I would love to say, as the chief of police, the most important thing is safety. It is the most important thing, but it kind of takes second base to educating our kids. But part of that education model has to be, how do we keep them safe? It's no different than we teach our own children when they grow up and they go off to college or wherever they go into the workforce, is that we teach them situational awareness, how to be safe. It's okay to report things. And then most importantly, I think for our educators is to build relationship with our kids, because I will tell you, first and foremost, if you have an authentic relationship with a child, they will tell you anything. And without having valid tips or concerns, then we're kind of blind. So there's no way that anybody can control any school district of any particular size, whether it's 10,000 kids or 100,000 kids, unless you have those authentic relationships and you have that same process with parent or parents.
That's outstanding. Doug, I'm going to give you and the chief the last word and we'll wrap it up.
Well, I just want to thank Chief Horn for showing up today. I'm going to give him the last word to just kind of whatever he wants to wrap up with. We just appreciate the insight, the look at, from the inside of a school, understanding like all the issues you deal with, and, the reinforcement of the idea that it is, a layered approach, and that one thing is not going to solve all your problems, but that communication is important, the posturing of security and that sort of deterrence and prevention, all of those coming together. So I just applaud you for the work you do, and thank you for taking the time today.
Well, I appreciate that as well. I even though the title, I don't get hung up in titles. My job is not the most important job in schools. Remember, our byproduct is truly educating kids. So the kudos have to go out to every teacher that shows up to work every day, every principal that shows up to every day, that takes on the burden of educating children. And especially where it's at today, we know that there's a lot of causation that's taken effect where we have people with tenure leaving our school districts, and we have other issues where we're trying to recruit and bring other students in and everything. So we appreciate everything, and thank you all very much for having us.
Chief Horn, thank you so much. Doug, appreciate your time as always. And with that, we're going to sign off for this week's episode. Join us next Friday, 9:30 Central Time. We look forward to it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.